next part, we are going to talk about client-server systems. First, we will talk about file server. File server stores the file required by the users on the network. When users need data from a file or group of files, they can send requests to the file server. The file server then sends the requested file or files to the user's computer. That is, the file server sends the entire file, not just the data needed by the users. Another type of architecture is called client-server. In client-server, the server is a computer providing data to the clients, which are the computers that are connected to a network and that people use to access data which is stored on a server. A server is also called back-end processor or back-end machine. A client is actually being called front-end processor or front-end machine. This is an example of file server architecture. And this is an example of a client-server architecture, which is a two-tier because we have the client and we have the server, or we have the front end and we have the back end. Because the client and server perform different functions and can run different operating systems, this arrangement of client-server architecture is called two-tier architecture. In a two-tier architecture, the server performs database functions and the client performs the presentation or user interface functions. When the client actually performs the business function, each client is being called a fat client in this arrangement. We might have client problems. When the programmers make changes to the business functions, they must make sure that they place the updated business functions of every client. For a company with thousands of clients, updating the business functions for all the clients is almost impossible. To eliminate this maintenance problem, we can place the business functions on the server. Because client performs only the presentation functions in this arrangement, each client is being called a thin client. We also have a three-tier architecture. The client performs the presentation function, a database server performs the database function, and a separate computer called application server performs the business function and serves as an interface between the client and the database systems. In a three-tier architecture, distributes the processing of functions so that you can eliminate the fat client maintenance problem and maximize the scalability of the system. As the number of users increases, we can upgrade the application and database servers by adding faster processor, disk, and hardware without changing the client computers. This is an example of three-tier client-server architecture. Now let's look at the advantages of client-server systems. Compared to file systems, a client-server approach has a lot of advantages. One of them could be lower network traffic. A client-server systems transmit only the necessary data rather than entire file across the network. Also, another advantage is to improve processing distribution. In a client-server system, we can distribute processing function among multiple computers. Another advantage could be thinner client. Because the application and database servers handle most of the processing in a client-server system, clients don't need to be very powerful or as expensive as where they have to be in a file server approach. Another advantage is greater processing transparency. As far as the user is concerned, all the processing occurs on a client, just as it does on a standalone system. The users, they don't need to learn any specific commands or techniques. Also, another advantage is increased network hardware and software transparency, because the client-server systems use the SQL command language, it's easier for the user to access data from a variety of sources. Also, it improves security, and a client-server system can provide a greater security than file systems and decrease costs. And the last advantage is increased scalability. In a three-tier client-server approach, it's more scalable than file server and also two-tier architecture. If an application server or database servers becomes a bottleneck, we can upgrade the appropriate server or add additional processes to share the processing load. Now let's discuss web access to the database. The Internet, which we call the World Wide Web, is a collection of millions of interconnected computers and computer networks that share the same resources. In particular, people and organizations use the word World Wide Web, or sometimes we call it the web, which is actually a vast collection of digital documents available on the Internet. Each digital document on the web is actually being called a web page. Web server, however, stores the web pages. So what is a web client? Web client is a computer requesting a web page, and each web page has a URL or uniform resource locator. The beginning of the URL, HTTP, specifies Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP, which is a data communication method that is being used by web clients and web servers to exchange data on the Internet. We also have a web browser, which is a computer program, which retrieves a web page from a web client. Popular web browsers are such as Microsoft Internet Explorer, Firefox, Google Chrome, Safari, and Opera. Maybe you have heard about TCP/IP. TCP/IP, or Transmission Control Protocol, an Internet protocol, is a standard protocol for communication on the Internet. A web page usually is being created using hypertext markup language, or what we call it HTML. This example shows you how to retrieve a web page on the Internet. So we have the web client, we have the Internet here, we need to have our communication protocol, HTTP, the TCP/IP, and also we need to have our web server and web pages. Now, what is the difference between static and dynamic web pages? Web page that display the same content for all web clients is being called static web pages. Dynamic web pages are pages whose content changes in response to different input and choices made using web clients. A dynamic web page includes trigger or instruction to tell the web server how to process the page, and possibly other instruction from the web browser to process it on the client side. Dynamic web pages, we have server-side extension or server-side scripting and client-side scripting or client-side extension. So the client-side extension can be embedded in HTML document or contained in a separate file that are referred with the HTML document, while the server-side extensions are usually separately executed programs. Client-side extensions can change the user interface in response to a user input action. JavaScript and Visual Basic Script are examples of client-side extension languages. Most server-side scripting are created using programming such as ASP.NET, Cold Fusion, and PHP is also frequently being used with the Apache server. Web servers, they must have a mechanism for communicating with the server-side extensions. Common gateway is called the CGI, an application program interface, which is the API, are standard interfaces that provide this capability. Three-tier architecture is a common web-based architecture that is being used. Web clients, web server, and as well as the database server. And this is an example of the three-tier web-based architecture.